I don't know when it started, that gnawing feeling in my gut that something wasn't quite right. At first, I thought it was just me, like maybe I was overthinking things because work had been slow, and I suddenly had more time to notice things I'd normally let slide. But as the days turned into weeks, that unease got louder, harder to ignore, like an alarm clock I couldn't shut off. Rachel wasn't herself anymore, at least not the Rachel I thought I knew, the woman I married 7 years ago. Back then, we were inseparable, the kind of couple people envied. We had our routines, our quirks, our inside jokes, like how she'd always steal the last slice of pizza and claim it was her reward for dealing with my snoring, or how she'd tease me about my inability to fold laundry properly, saying, "You'd think a grown man could figure out a t-shirt." But now, those moments felt like relics of another life. Rachel was distant, distracted, and not in the usual, "I've had a long day" kind of way. This was different, deeper. She'd stay late at work more often than not, and the excuses were always airtight. "We're finalizing the campaign," she'd say, or, "Mr. Anderson wants this presentation perfect for tomorrow." Mr. Anderson. That name. I couldn't explain why it left a bitter taste in my mouth. I didn't even know the guy, but the way she talked about him, it was strange. Not just professional respect, but something else. Almost reverence. Then there were the phone calls. Rachel's phone used to be just another object in the house, lying around like a forgotten remote control. But now, when it buzzed, she'd suddenly spring into action, picking it up and walking into another room. "Work stuff," she'd say with a quick kiss on my cheek before disappearing into the hallway or out onto the porch. I told myself it was nothing. I mean, who doesn't get work calls at odd hours these days? But those kisses, those weren't the same anymore. They felt rushed, almost obligatory, like she was crossing an item off her to-do list. It wasn't just the emotional distance. It was physical, too. The woman who used to lean into my shoulder during movie nights now sat at the edge of the couch, her phone practically glued to her hand. The warmth that had been a constant in our marriage was replaced by something cold, intangible, but very real. I remember one night vividly. We were at the dinner table, and I asked her how her day went. Her face lit up as she talked about a new project, her eyes sparkling in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. But then she said it. "Mr. Anderson had this brilliant idea." My stomach clenched. I forced a smile, nodding as if I cared about her boss's brilliance. But inside, I felt something crack. I knew I was losing her. To what or whom, I didn't know yet. Still, I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was being paranoid, projecting my own frustrations onto her. Work had been slow for me, and Rachel had always been the ambitious one. Maybe I was just insecure, feeling like I wasn't enough anymore. But deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong. And the worst part? She didn't even seem to notice. It was a Saturday afternoon when everything came crashing down, the kind of day that starts off so ordinary you'd never expect it to end with your life flipped upside down. Rachel had gone out to run some errands, nothing unusual. I stayed home, tidying up the house, a habit of mine when I needed to clear my head. I guess I thought if I could organize the chaos around me, it might help me deal with the chaos brewing inside. Her phone was on the kitchen counter. Normally, I wouldn't touch it. We always had this unspoken rule about privacy. But that day, something felt different. It buzzed, lighting up with a notification. I glanced over, and there it was, a name that made my blood run cold. Anderson. I told myself to let it go, to walk away and not cross that line. But my hands moved before my brain could catch up. I picked up the phone, heart pounding, and saw the preview of the message. "Can't wait to see you Monday. You looked stunning yesterday, as always." My stomach dropped. Stunning yesterday? Yesterday, she'd told me she was working late at the office. I stared at the screen, the words blurring as anger, betrayal, and disbelief battled for dominance in my head. For a moment, I put the phone down and took a deep breath, my hands trembling so badly I couldn't trust myself to act rationally. But that nagging feeling, the one that had been eating away at me for weeks, was screaming now. I picked the phone back up and opened the message thread. There it was. Text after text, casual on the surface but laced with intimacy that had no business existing between my wife and her boss. Compliments, jokes, inside references. And then the one that hit me like a punch to the gut. Last night was amazing. I love how you laugh when you're with me. Don't let him make you feel guilty. You deserve better. Better? Better than what? Better than me? I sat down on the edge of the kitchen chair, the phone still in my hand, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced, replaying every moment of the past few weeks with brutal clarity. The late nights, the phone calls, the distant kisses. They all fit together now, forming a picture I didn't want to see. And then I saw it. A photo. My hands shook as I tapped on it. Rachel was dressed in the outfit she'd worn on one of her supposed late nights, sitting across from Anderson at a fancy restaurant. Her smile was radiant, but it wasn't for me. I stared at that picture, trying to make sense of the woman I saw. This was my wife, the person I'd built a life with. But in that photo, she felt like a stranger. I didn't confront her right away. I couldn't. Instead, I spent the rest of the day in a haze, replaying everything in my mind. How had I missed this? Was I too trusting, too blind? Or had she been that good at hiding it? By the time she came home, I'd managed to shove everything deep enough down to put on a facade of normalcy. She greeted me with a smile, one I couldn't return. I watched her as she moved around the house, laughing at something on her phone, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. That night, as we sat on the couch, I studied her face. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to beg her to tell me I was wrong. But instead, I asked her if she wanted tea, because sometimes when you're standing at the edge of a cliff, you need a moment to steady yourself before deciding whether to jump or pull back. I wasn't ready to jump. Not yet. The next day felt like walking on shards of glass. Rachel moved around the house as if everything was fine, humming while she got ready for work, her usual upbeat self. But I couldn't see her the same way anymore. Every smile she gave me felt forced, every kiss on the cheek a dagger twisted deeper. My thoughts were consumed by those messages, that photo, proof that the woman I trusted had betrayed me. I decided I couldn't let this fester any longer. That evening, when she came home, I waited until we were settled on the couch. She was scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. I stared at her, trying to reconcile the Rachel I married with the Rachel sitting across from me. Finally, I broke the silence. "Rachel," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "We need to talk." She froze, her finger hovering over her phone. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice cautious. The shift in her tone was immediate, as if she could sense what was coming. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "I know about you and Anderson." Her reaction was subtle, but I caught it. A flicker of panic in her eyes before she quickly masked it. "What are you talking about?" she said, forcing a nervous laugh. I reached for her phone, which was lying on the coffee table, and opened the messages. "This," I said, holding it up for her to see. "This is what I'm talking about." Her face went pale. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just stared at the screen as if the messages might disappear if she looked long enough. Then she shook her head, a weak attempt at denial. "It's not what it looks like," she whispered, but even she didn't sound convinced. "Not what it looks like?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Rachel, I read the messages. I saw the photo. Don't insult me by pretending there's some innocent explanation for this." She finally looked up at me, her eyes wide and brimming with something I couldn't quite place. Guilt? Fear? Defiance? Okay, she said, crossing her arms. Yes, I've been spending time with Anderson. But it's not like I planned for this to happen. It just did. It just did, I said, laughing bitterly. Like tripping over a crack in the sidewalk, right? Cheating on your husband was an accident? She flinched but didn't back down. You don't understand, she said, her tone defensive. He makes me feel appreciated. He listens to me. Don't, I interrupted, holding up a hand. Don't you dare finish that sentence. Whatever he does for you, it doesn't justify what you've done to me. To us. For a moment, her expression softened, and I thought she might apologize. But then her defenses went back up, and her tone turned sharp. Maybe if you'd been more present, she snapped, I wouldn't have needed someone else to make me feel special. Her words hit me like a slap. I stood up, anger boiling over. Are you kidding me? I said, my voice shaking. I've been here, Rachel. Every single day I've been here, trying to be the best husband I can be. But apparently, that's not good enough for you because your boss decided to play the role of the alpha male and you fell for it. She stood too, her eyes blazing. You think this is easy for me? She shot back. Do you have any idea how lonely I've felt? How much pressure I'm under at work? Anderson understands that. He supports me in ways you never have. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Oh, he supports you, does he? I'm sure that's what he tells every woman he's sleeping with. You think you're special to him, Rachel? To him, you're just another conquest. Her face turned red. Whether from anger or shame, I couldn't tell. You don't know him, she said through gritted teeth. And I don't need to, I replied, my voice cold. I know enough. I know he's a coward who preys on women who can't see through his act. And I know you let him. We stood there, locked in a tense standoff, the air between us charged with anger and hurt. Finally, I broke the silence. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice low and steady. You're going to end this, today. You're going to tell him it's over and cut all contact with him. If you don't, you can pack your bags and leave, because I'm not going to share my wife with another man. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought she might fight back. But then she sank onto the couch, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I need time to think, she murmured, her voice barely audible. I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. Time to think? You've had plenty of time to think while sneaking around behind my back. But fine. Take your time. Just know that my patience is running out. I walked out of the room, leaving her sitting there in stunned silence. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding, but I felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was in control. Whether or not our marriage survived would depend on what she chose to do next, but I wasn't going to let her indecision drag me down with her. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there staring at the ceiling, every second feeling like an eternity. Rachel was in the bedroom, but it was like she wasn't even there. The weight of her betrayal pressed down on me like a physical force, making it impossible to think clearly. The worst part was knowing that she hadn't even made a choice yet. She was still teetering on the edge, torn between me and him, as if there was any comparison to be made. By morning, the resentment bubbling inside me was almost unbearable. She got up before me, her movements quiet and cautious, like she was trying not to disturb a sleeping bear. When I walked into the kitchen, she was sitting at the table with a mug of coffee in her hands, staring into the dark liquid as if it held all the answers she couldn't find. I leaned against the counter, watching her. She looked small, almost fragile, but I couldn't let myself soften. Not now. Have you made your decision? I asked, my voice flat and cold. She flinched at the sound of my voice but didn't look up. Thomas, I don't know what to do, she murmured, her words barely above a whisper. I slammed my glass of water onto the counter, harder than I intended. What's there to think about, Rachel? You've been living two lives, and now it's time to pick one, him or me. Her shoulders slumped, and she let out a shaky breath. It's not that simple, she said, her voice cracking. It is that simple, I snapped, my frustration boiling over. You made it complicated when you let him into our lives. You chose to cheat. You chose to betray me, and now you're telling me you're stuck in some kind of moral gray area? Come on, Rachel, be honest. If you want to be with him, just say it. Her face crumpled, tears welling up in her eyes. I don't want to lose you, she said finally, her voice trembling. But I don't know if we can come back from this. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. Of all the things she could have said, that was the last thing I expected. It wasn't anger. It wasn't an excuse. It was doubt. She didn't even know if she wanted to save us. I can't make that decision for you, I said, my tone softer but still firm. But I'll tell you this. I'm not going to wait around forever. If you want to fix this, if you want to fix us, you need to let him go completely. No contact, no excuses, no lingering feelings. Otherwise, we're done. She nodded slowly, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She wasn't ready to let go, not yet. And that terrified me. I walked away, leaving her at the kitchen table with her cold coffee and her shattered thoughts. I couldn't sit there and wait for her to figure it out. I had to give her the space to make her choice, even if it meant risking everything. The rest of the day was a blur. I kept myself busy, cleaning the garage, mowing the lawn, anything to keep my mind off the ticking clock. Rachel stayed in the bedroom most of the day, and I let her. I didn't want to see her, didn't want to hear her. Every time I thought about her hesitating, about her weighing me against Anderson, it made my blood boil. By evening, the tension was suffocating. I was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, when she finally walked into the living room. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen. She looked like she hadn't slept or eaten all day. I need time, she said, her voice barely audible. I stood up, the anger flaring again. Time? I repeated, my voice sharp. You've had time, Rachel, weeks of it. I've been sitting here, waiting, hoping you'd come to your senses. But all you've done is push me further away. So no, you don't get more time. You make your choice tonight, or I'll make it for you. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, she sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. I can't do this right now, she whispered. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Of course you can't, because making a choice would mean taking responsibility for what you've done. And God forbid you have to face the consequences. I walked out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking, but I didn't regret my words. She needed to understand that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about us, our marriage, our life together. And if she couldn't see that, then maybe it was already over. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling once again, I realized something. I couldn't wait forever. If Rachel didn't make her choice soon, I'd have to make it for her. And that was a decision I didn't know if I was ready to make. The next morning, I woke up feeling like a tightly wound spring ready to snap. Rachel had left for work without much of a word, just a quick, awkward goodbye that lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. I watched her drive off, wondering if she was heading to work or straight into his arms. My patience, what little of it remained, was gone. I couldn't sit around anymore, waiting for her to decide whether she wanted me or him. That was when it hit me. If Rachel wasn't going to cut Anderson out of her life, maybe it was time I made my stance clear. To him. The drive to her office felt surreal, like I was on autopilot. I kept gripping the steering wheel tighter and tighter, my knuckles white. The thought of confronting him made my blood boil, but it also gave me a twisted sense of purpose. If he thought he could worm his way into my marriage and get away with it, he had another thing coming. Her office building was sleek and modern, a fortress of glass and steel. I parked in the visitor's lot, sat for a moment, and tried to calm my racing heart. This wasn't the smartest move. I knew that. But I didn't care. This wasn't about being smart. It was about being heard. I walked into the lobby, trying to keep my steps steady, my expression neutral. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Mr. Anderson," I said, keeping my voice even. Her eyebrows arched slightly, but she didn't ask questions. She picked up the phone, spoke briefly, then nodded toward the elevators. "Second floor, end of the hallway." As I rode the elevator, my heart pounded harder. When the door slid open, I stepped into a hallway lined with doors. His office was at the very end, the door wide open. I saw him before he saw me, sitting behind a massive desk, typing on his computer. He looked exactly how I'd imagined. Expensive suit, perfect hair, and an air of smug arrogance that made me want to punch him before I even said a word. "Mr. Anderson," I said, stepping into the room. He looked up, startled for a split second, before his expression shifted to one of amused curiosity. "You must be Thomas," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I've been expecting you." The casualness in his tone made my blood boil. "We need to talk," I said, keeping my voice tight. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please, have a seat." "I'm fine standing," I replied coldly. "I know about you and Rachel. I'm here to tell you it ends now." His smirk widened, like he found the whole thing entertaining. "Is that so?" "Yes," I said, my voice firm. "Whatever you think you have with her, it's over. She's my wife, and you need to stay away from her." He chuckled, a low, condescending sound that made my fists clench. "Look," he said, leaning forward, "I get it. This must be hard for you. But Rachel's a grown woman. She makes her own decisions. If she wants to be with me, that's her choice." "Her choice?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You manipulated her. You took advantage of her stress, her vulnerabilities. That's not a choice. That's coercion." He stood up then, his smirk fading as his tone turned colder. "Let me make something clear," he said, stepping closer. "Rachel came to me, not the other way around. And if she's unhappy in your marriage, that's not my problem. Maybe you should take a long, hard look in the mirror before blaming me." I stepped closer too, my anger bubbling over. "Listen to me," I said, my voice low and steady. "I'm only going to say this once. Stay away from my wife, or you'll regret it." He raised an eyebrow, his smirk returning. "Are you threatening me?" "It's not a threat," I said. "It's a promise." For a moment we stood there, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally he shrugged, his casual demeanor returning. "Fine," he said, walking back to his desk. "I'll give Rachel some space to figure out what she wants. But don't think for a second that you can intimidate me. I don't scare easily." I didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. I turned and walked out, my fists still clenched, my jaw tight. The drive home was a blur, my mind replaying every word of our conversation. I had made my stance clear, but I knew this wasn't over. Anderson wasn't the type to back down, and neither was I. I thought I had made myself clear when I left Anderson's office. I thought my warning, even if he'd laughed it off, would at least make him think twice before pulling any more stunts. But I underestimated him. I underestimated his arrogance, his audacity, and his belief that he could walk over anyone without consequences. That evening the house was quiet. Too quiet. Rachel and I barely spoke to each other. She stayed in the kitchen, pretending to be busy, and I stayed in the living room, nursing a glass of water and flipping through TV channels more for the noise than anything else. The tension in the air was unbearable, thick and oppressive, like a storm that refused to break. Then the doorbell rang. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor, someone dropping off misdelivered mail or borrowing a tool. But when I opened the door, my breath caught in my chest. Standing there, smug as ever, was Anderson. He wore the same tailored suit he'd been wearing earlier, but there was something different about him now, something more menacing. He had that same cocky smirk on his face, like showing up uninvited to another man's house was completely normal. "What the hell are you doing here?" I asked, my voice low, barely keeping my anger in check. He didn't flinch. Instead, he brushed past me, stepping into my house without so much as an invitation. "Relax," he said casually, looking around as if he owned the place. "I thought we could have a little chat, man to man." "Get out," I said, my voice firm, my fists already clenching. "Not until we settle a few things," he replied, turning to face me. His smirk was gone now, replaced by a cold, calculating expression that made my skin crawl. "You see, you came into my office today threatening me. I didn't appreciate that." I took a step closer, my jaw tightening. "And yet, here you are, proving my point about being a smug, arrogant—" "Careful," he interrupted, his tone sharp. "You're already in over your head. Let me make something clear. Rachel is with me because she wants to be. You can yell, threaten, or throw tantrums all you want, but you can't change that." His words hit like a punch to the gut. I wanted to scream, to tell him he was wrong, but the confidence in his voice shook me. Before I could respond, Rachel walked into the room. Her eyes widened when she saw him, and she froze, her face pale. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a mixture of shock and nervousness. "Just having a conversation with your husband," he said smoothly, his demeanor shifting to something almost charming. "It seems he's having a hard time understanding the situation." Rachel's gaze darted between us, her hands trembling. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice cracking. "Why not?" he asked, stepping closer to her. "I'm just trying to clear the air. Isn't that what you wanted? Honesty?" That was it. I'd had enough. I stepped between them, my body tense, my voice shaking with rage. I said, "Get out." Anderson turned to me, his smirk returning. "Or what?" he asked, leaning in slightly, daring me to make a move. And then it happened. Without warning, he slapped me. A hard, stinging slap that echoed through the room. For a moment, I just stood there, stunned. Rachel gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Anderson didn't flinch. He just stood there looking at me like I was beneath him. "You don't deserve her," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're weak, pathetic. No wonder she came to me." Time seemed to slow down. The room blurred, and all I could hear was my heartbeat pounding in my ears. My vision tunneled on him, his smug face, his arrogant posture. He had crossed the line, not just as a man, but as a human being. Something inside me snapped. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just moved. My hand shot out, grabbing his arm before he could step back. His smirk faltered, replaced by surprise and then fear as I twisted his wrist. "You think you can come into my house, insult me, and walk away?" I growled, my voice low and dangerous. He tried to pull away, but I didn't let go. With a surge of strength I didn't know I had, I forced him down, twisting his arm until I heard the sickening crack of bone. He screamed, a high-pitched, panicked sound that only fueled my anger. I let go, and he stumbled back, clutching his now useless hand, his face pale with pain. Rachel screamed, rushing forward, but I stopped her with a look. "Stay back," I said, my voice cold. Anderson glared at me, his face twisted in pain. "You're insane," he spat. "You'll pay for this." "Get out of my house," I said, stepping toward him. "And if I ever see you again, you'll leave with more than a broken hand." He didn't argue. He staggered to the door, throwing one last glare over his shoulder before disappearing into the night. I turned to Rachel, who was staring at me like she didn't recognize the man in front of her. "This ends now," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. You decide tonight, Rachel. Him or me. And with that, I walked away, leaving her standing in the wreckage of everything we had built. The house was silent after Anderson left, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. It was the heavy, suffocating kind. The kind that crawls under your skin and makes you want to scream just to break it. Rachel stayed rooted in place by the couch, her face pale, her hands trembling as she stared at the door Anderson had slammed behind him. I didn't know what she was thinking, but I couldn't bring myself to care. My mind was too clouded with anger, betrayal, and the adrenaline from what had just happened. I walked to the bedroom, shutting the door behind me, needing a moment to breathe. My hands were still shaking, my chest heaving with uneven breaths. I'd lost control back there, but I didn't regret it. Not one bit. Anderson deserved worse, but breaking his hand was enough to send a message. As I leaned against the wall, staring at the ceiling, I felt the weight of what I'd said to Rachel before walking away. Him or me. The ultimatum had been boiling inside me for days, weeks even, but saying it out loud had made it real. There was no going back now. She had to choose, and she had to choose tonight. Hours passed. I sat on the edge of the bed, waiting for her to come to me, to say something, anything. But the door didn't open. The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards as she paced the living room. I imagined her, sitting there with her head in her hands, trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong. I wanted to believe she was regretting her choices, that she was finally starting to see the damage she'd caused. But another part of me, the bitter, wounded part, couldn't help but wonder if she was thinking about him. Was she replaying the fight in her head and wishing she could run after him instead of facing me? By the time I finally stepped out of the bedroom, the house was dark except for the dim glow of the kitchen light. Rachel was sitting at the table, her shoulders slumped, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. She didn't look up as I walked in, and for a moment, I just stood there, unsure of what to say. "Have you made your decision?" I asked finally, my voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. She flinched, her grip tightening on the mug. "Thomas, I don't know what to do," she said, her voice trembling. I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my anger in check. "What's there to think about, Rachel? You've been living two lives, and now it's time to pick one. Him or me." Her shoulders slumped even further, and she let out a shaky breath. "It's not that simple," she murmured, her words barely audible. I slammed my hand on the counter, the sound echoing through the kitchen. "It is that simple," I snapped. "You made it complicated when you let him into our lives. You chose to cheat. You chose to betray me. And now you're telling me you're stuck in some kind of moral gray area? Be honest, Rachel. If you want to be with him, just say it." Her face crumpled, tears spilling over her cheeks. "I don't want to lose you," she said finally, her voice shaking. "But I don't know if we can come back from this." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I had braced myself for anger, excuses, even for her to choose him. But this? Her doubt, her hesitation, it cut deeper than anything else. It felt like she was dangling our marriage over a cliff, unsure whether to save it or let it fall. "I can't make that decision for you," I said, my tone quieter now but no less firm. "But I'll tell you this. I'm not going to wait forever. If you want to fix this, if you want to fix us, you need to let him go completely. No contact, no excuses, no lingering feelings. Otherwise, we're done." She nodded slowly, her tears falling onto the table. But I wasn't convinced. Words were easy, actions were harder. And right now, I needed more than words. The rest of the night passed in a haze. I went back to the bedroom, leaving her in the kitchen with her thoughts. I didn't sleep. How could I? The woman I loved was out there, wrestling with whether or not she wanted to stay with me. That thought alone was enough to keep me wide awake, staring at the ceiling as the hours dragged by. When I walked back into the kitchen the next morning, Rachel was still sitting at the table, looking as though she hadn't moved all night. Her hair was a mess, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen. She glanced up at me as I entered, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. "I ended it," she said finally, her voice hoarse. I raised an eyebrow, unsure whether to believe her. "Just like that?" She nodded, her hands trembling as she pushed her phone across the table toward me. "I called him last night. I told him it was over and that I didn't want any more contact with him. I blocked his number. It's done." I picked up the phone, scrolling through her messages. Sure enough, there it was. A final text to Anderson, short and to the point. "It's over." It was what I'd wanted to hear, but the doubt lingered. Could I trust her again? Could we ever be the same? I should have felt relieved when Rachel told me she ended it, but relief didn't come. Instead, there was this hollow, gnawing emptiness in its place. The words were there. "It's over." But they didn't erase the texts, the photo, or the betrayal. Trust isn't something you can snap back into place like a broken branch. It takes time. And even then, the cracks remain. The first few days were unbearable. Rachel tried to stay out of my way, hovering around the house like a shadow. She would glance at me, her eyes filled with regret and something that looked like fear, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. I didn't know if I wanted to. I was too angry, too hurt. The woman I had trusted more than anyone had lied to me, and now we were both stuck in the fallout. She quit her job 3 days later. I came home from running errands to find her sitting at the kitchen table, her resignation letter folded neatly in front of her. "I can't work there anymore," she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to see it as a good sign, a step towards severing the ties that had pulled us apart. But another part of me wondered if it was just guilt pushing her to extremes. Was this her way of trying to prove something to me, or was it genuine? The resignation marked a shift in our dynamic, but it didn't magically fix things. We were like two strangers living under the same roof, tiptoeing around each other, careful not to set off the landmines buried in every corner of our home. Conversations were short, tense, meals were eaten in silence. And at night, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if we'd ever find our way back to what we once had. The anger simmered quietly beneath the surface, boiling over in small, cutting remarks I couldn't hold back. "You're awfully quiet," I said one evening as we sat at the dinner table. "Thinking about him?" Rachel froze, her fork hovering midair. "No," she said softly. "I'm thinking about us, about how to fix this." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But every time I looked at her, I saw flashes of those texts, that photo, the way her face had lit up talking about Anderson. My mind refused to let it go, replaying every lie she'd told, every moment she'd chosen him over me. She tried, though. I have to give her that. She started cooking my favorite meals, planning little outings for us, even bringing home a book on marriage counseling. At first, I brushed off her efforts, too wrapped up in my own bitterness to care. But over time, something started to shift. It was subtle, like a small crack of light breaking through the darkness. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Rachel turned to me, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I know I've hurt you more than I can ever make up for," she said, her voice trembling. "But I'm not giving up on us. Even if it takes the rest of my life, I'll do whatever it takes to earn your forgiveness." Her words caught me off guard. For the first time in weeks, I saw the pain in her eyes. The pain of someone who knew they had made a terrible mistake and was desperate to make things right. It didn't erase what she'd done, but it softened something inside me. The next day, we started counseling. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, sitting in a stranger's office, airing out all our dirty laundry, But I knew we couldn't fix this on our own. The sessions were tough, forcing us to confront the hard truths we'd both been avoiding. One afternoon, during a particularly emotional session, Rachel broke down completely. "I don't know why I let it happen," she sobbed. "I was lonely, and he made me feel wanted. But it wasn't real. It was selfish and stupid, and I hate myself for what I did to you." Her tears were raw, unfiltered. For the first time, I saw just how deeply she regretted her actions. And as much as I wanted to hold on to my anger, I couldn't. Seeing her like that, so broken, so vulnerable, reminded me of the woman I fell in love with. The woman I still loved, despite everything. It didn't happen overnight, but slowly I began to let go of the anger. We started talking more, laughing occasionally, finding little pieces of joy in the wreckage of our marriage. It wasn't perfect, and it probably never would be. But it was progress. Rebuilding trust is harder than breaking it. That's something I learned the hard way. When Rachel said she ended things with Anderson, I wanted to believe her. I really did. But every time I looked at her, a voice in the back of my head whispered, "What if she's lying?" Every buzz of her phone, every time she stepped out of the room, I couldn't help but wonder, is he still there, lurking in the background? Rachel sensed it, of course. She tried her best to show me she was committed to us, but trust isn't something you can rebuild with grand gestures alone. It's a process, slow and agonizing, like trying to glue together a shattered mirror. And even then, the cracks remain. The first few weeks were the hardest. Rachel went out of her way to prove she was done with him. She blocked his number, deleted his messages, even handed me her phone one evening saying, "Here, check if you need to." I didn't take it. I wanted to, but I knew that spying on her wouldn't solve anything. If I couldn't trust her, then what was the point of all this? She quit her job too, which shocked me. Rachel had always been so passionate about her work, so driven. Leaving her career behind was a big deal, and I couldn't help but wonder if she resented me for it. "I need a fresh start," she told me when I asked why. "That place is full of memories I don't want to keep." It was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't enough to erase the damage. The house was still thick with tension, and conversations were short and clipped. We were like two strangers navigating a battlefield, each step careful, deliberate, and exhausting. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, I couldn't hold back anymore. "Do you still think about him?" I asked, my voice sharp. Rachel froze, her fork hovering midair. "No," she said softly. "I think about us, about how to fix this." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But the scars were still fresh, and my mind refused to let me forget. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that photo, the messages, the way she'd pulled away from me while she gave her attention to someone else. But slowly, things started to shift. Rachel made an effort to reconnect with me in ways that felt genuine, not forced. She started cooking my favorite meals again, surprising me with little notes left on my desk or in my car. She suggested we go for walks in the evening, just to talk, something we hadn't done in years. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, she turned to me with tears in her eyes. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she said, her voice trembling. "But I'm not giving up. I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that I'm sorry." Her words hit me hard. For the first time, I saw how much pain she was in, not just because of what she'd done, but because of what it had done to us. It didn't erase the hurt, but it softened something inside me. Counseling helped too, though I hated the idea at first. Sitting in a stranger's office, airing out all our dirty laundry, it felt intrusive, even humiliating. But Rachel insisted, and deep down, I knew we couldn't fix this on our own. Our counselor was blunt, which I appreciated. She didn't take sides or sugarcoat things. She forced us to confront the truths we'd been avoiding for years. Rachel admitted how lonely she'd felt, how she'd let the pressures of work and life drive a wedge between us. And I admitted my own failures, the way I'd let complacency take over, the way I'd assumed our marriage would thrive without effort. One session in particular stood out. Rachel broke down, sobbing as she confessed, "I let him fill a void that I should have brought to you. It wasn't real. It was selfish and stupid, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Her honesty was raw, unfiltered, and it hit me like a punch to the gut. For the first time, I saw the depth of her regret, the pain she carried because of the choices she'd made. And for the first time, I realized that holding on to my anger wasn't just punishing her. It was punishing me too. Letting go of that anger wasn't easy, but I started trying. We began talking more, laughing occasionally, finding small moments of joy in the wreckage of our marriage. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was progress. Rebuilding trust is like planting a garden after a wildfire. The ground is scorched, barren, and it feels impossible to believe anything will grow again. But with time, patience, and effort, little signs of life start to appear. That's where we were. A fragile beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. Months passed, and slowly, painfully, Rachel and I began to piece our lives back together. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't quick. Trust, once broken, is never the same. It's like trying to repair a shattered vase. You can glue it back together, but the cracks will always be visible. Rachel was relentless in her efforts to make amends. She knew this wasn't something she could fix with a single apology or a few grand gestures. She put in the work day by day, little by little, showing me that she was committed to rebuilding what we had lost. And I had to decide if I was willing to meet her halfway. We kept going to counseling, even when it felt like dragging a boulder uphill. Our sessions were raw and uncomfortable, forcing us to confront the ugly truths we'd both buried for too long. I realized I hadn't been as present as I thought I had been, that I'd taken our marriage for granted in ways I didn't fully understand until it was almost gone. Rachel, on the other hand, had to face the consequences of her actions head-on, to own the betrayal and the pain she'd caused. One day, during a particularly tough session, Rachel turned to me, tears streaming down her face. "I know I broke us," she said, her voice trembling. "And I know I'll never be able to fix what I've done completely. But I want to try. I want us to have a chance to be whole again." Her words were honest, unguarded, and they hit me hard. For the first time, I saw just how much she regretted what she'd done. Not just for my sake, but for the sake of everything we'd built together. It didn't erase the hurt, but it was a start. Back at home, things were different. There were moments when we felt like us again, laughing over something silly or sitting quietly together on the porch, watching the world go by. But those moments were fragile, like glass. They could shatter at any second, and the fear of that kept me guarded. One evening, as we sat on the couch, Rachel leaned into me for the first time in months. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. "I miss this," she whispered. "I miss us." "I miss us too," I admitted, though the words felt heavy in my mouth. "But it's going to take time, Rachel. A lot of time." "I know," she said, her voice soft. "And I'm okay with that. As long as we're trying, I'm okay with it." We started finding our way back to each other, one step at a time. Rachel surprised me with little things, making my favorite meal, leaving a note on my pillow, suggesting a weekend getaway just for us. At first, I was skeptical, thinking it was just guilt driving her actions. But over time, I saw the sincerity in her efforts. She wasn't trying to win me over. She was trying to show me that she was all in. For my part, I tried to let go of the anger that had consumed me for so long. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I felt like I was still stuck in the thick of it, unable to move forward. But I kept reminding myself of what I wanted. Not revenge, not bitterness, but a marriage that could survive the storm we'd been through. One evening, as we sat on the porch, the sun dipping below the horizon, Rachel reached for my hand. "Do you think we'll ever be okay again?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't see the woman who had betrayed me. I saw the woman I fell in love with. The woman who had made a terrible mistake but was trying with everything she had to make it right. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I think we're starting to be. And maybe that's enough for now." She nodded, her fingers tightening around mine. "It's enough for me. The truth is, I didn't know where we'd end up. Maybe we'd rebuild something stronger, or maybe the cracks would eventually pull us apart. But for now, we had a fragile hope, a tentative new beginning. And sometimes that's all you need to keep going."